We are back. Back from the 2 days, the 2-day holiday that completes Passover, Pesach. That was 7th and 8th day Pesach in the diaspora. They only celebrate 7th day Pesach in Israel, but outside Israel, 7th and 8th day. How's everybody doing? How are we holding up? Unprecedented times get stranger and stranger, curious and curiouser. But this pause, this holy pause that we took for the holiday, it was very special. It really was very special to spend that time with our family. We're very blessed. We had 4 people in the house, Nina and I and our kids. We recognize not everybody is so lucky. How was it for you? How has this Pesach holiday been for you? How has Passover been? Where are you tuning in from now? It's kind of an odd little moment, right? It's Thursday night. We've just come out of Passover, and tomorrow night is Shabbat. So going right out of sort of ending Passover and getting back to our regular lives. But then tomorrow is Friday, and we spend the day preparing for Shabbos. And of course, that's so apropos of what we're studying together here in the Talmud. We were away for 2 days. I'm not going to be doing a double show tonight. I may try to do one tomorrow, but tomorrow's topic is a pretty interesting one. So tomorrow we'll be doing page 41 of Tractate Shabbos, and there we're going to look into the prohibition for a Jewish male to spill seed. That's going to be a pretty interesting and perhaps controversial topic that we'll discuss tomorrow. For today, where are we holding? We are in Tractate Shabbos, second volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 3. We're discussing the third Mishnah. Part of the third Mishnah discussed this historical episode where the people of Tiberias, where there are hot springs, Tiberias is a city in Israel, and there are hot springs there, and they were there 2,000 years ago in Talmudic times. And the question came up, would it be possible to run a pipe of drinkable water, say cold water, through these hot springs, which had not, the water in the hot springs was not drinkable, but if you could run a pipe through that hot water, you could heat up the drinkable water. And then the question was, could you drink that water on Shabbos? And our sages ended up prohibiting that. They prohibited it because that was water heated up during Shabbos. As we discussed, what it's prohibited to do is to heat up water on Shabbos. You can't cook on Shabbat, and you can't heat water as part of the prohibition on cooking, right? So that's why we cook our food before Shabbos. What we can do is keep our food warm during Shabbos. We can even warm up food during Shabbos, but we cannot cook it. It has to be cooked before Shabbos. That's the basic prohibition. So now, when they in discussing the story of those pipes that went through the hot water, through the hot spring in Tiberias, we also discussed this idea that in addition to you cannot heat up water to cook in it on Shabbos, you also cannot heat up water to bathe on Shabbos, right? You can't kindle a fire, and therefore you can't heat water, and therefore you can't take a hot bath. So the question came up, what about water that was heated before Shabbos? If the water was heated before Shabbos, can you take a bath in it during Shabbos? That is the question that came before the sages. And what's interesting is that the answer to that question was not so much the result of logic or of making an interpretation of a verse. Obviously, the situation itself is not covered in the Torah. In figuring out what the answer would be, the answer didn't come so much from interpreting a verse in the Torah as reacting to the reality on the ground. So here's where we really see our sages acting not just in sort of the purity of figuring out what the true answer is, but also understanding how their rulings affect people. In other words, it's looking at the law of unintended consequences, or perhaps not so much legislative consequences as the legislative process, right? I mean, this happens all the time. You have a behavior that strikes the people as wrong, the government steps in, makes a ruling, then they see how that law is actually applied in the real world, and they adjust the law. And this was what happened in this kind of historical process in the Holy Land during the time of the sages. So initially, one could bathe in hot water, water that was heated before Shabbos. You could take a bath in that hot water during Shabbos. And logically speaking, that makes sense. Now, to get the picture in your head, it's not, they didn't have the electronic gas-powered tankless heater that's on the side of the house, turn on the shower, tap, or the bathtub filler, and draw a hot bath in the house, right? That was just not available to almost anybody in Talmudic times. Perhaps the mega rich had something similar to that. But for the average person to take a bath in Talmudic times, they went to the bathhouse, right? So the bathhouse, you can think of it like a modern spa, right? So it's a beautiful place. I mean, if you could afford the nice one, I suppose there were probably some, real run-of-the-mill places too. But generally speaking, it was a nice place where a lot of people would go. There was a men's bathhouse, there was a women's bathhouse, there was the outer chamber, the inner chamber. They kept the water as clean as was possible, I imagine, with the technology of that time. But basically what they had was, a large enough body of water that a lot of people could come in and out of it, bathe in it, hit the locker room, go in, get clean. There was actually a teaching, which we also encounter on these pages, that after you've been in the hot bath, you should go in the cold bath. That's good for you. In the same way that metal is hardened after going from hot to cold. The cold is good for a person. That's a digression. The question was, could you go to this bathhouse on Shabbat if the water was heated in the bathhouse before Shabbos, right? So you for sure, if they're heating the water during Shabbat, you can't go take a bath in that bathhouse. So even back then. But with the water heated before Shabbat, yes, you could take a bath. But our sages observed that the attendants in the bathhouse started to cheat, right? Because a lot of people were coming to take their bath on Shabbat. It was a great day for a bath, right? It's the day off. It's the day of rest. A lot of people who don't have time or inclination or availability to take that bath during the week would love to take the bath on Shabbat. To keep the water hot for all these people that were coming on Shabbat, the attendants in the bathhouse started to run the furnace, as it were, started to burn the coals underneath that body of water, however it was that they heated the water on Shabbat, right? And so because the attendants were basically lying, because they knew that the people wouldn't come if it was heated on Shabbat, but because they, were cheating the system and heating the water during Shabbos, therefore the sages said we can no longer allow people to take a bath in hot water on Shabbat if the water was heated before Shabbat, because the attendants in the bathhouses are cheating. So we no longer allow taking a bath in water that was heated before Shabbos. But if people want to go into a bathhouse that was heated before Shabbos, and just that the house is heated, right? The entrances are closed, so it's still a hot place. Even if they're not running the furnace under the water to heat the water, right? The bathhouse itself remains a hot place, and you can go in there and have a sweat, a schwitz, right? That's and it seems like that's sort of gone from the world of calling it a schwitz, but people still have saunas, right? You go in and have a sweat. And then afterwards, you could dip in cold water. That you could still do on Shabbos. But the sages observed that people who were claiming that they only went to the bathhouse to have a sweat were in fact getting into the water and having a hot bath in the water that was being heated by those attendants who were cheating on Shabbos. So, lest people come to violate the prohibition on heating water on Shabbos and bathing in it, they said no more. You can't even go to the bathhouse to have a sweat. But they still permitted people to go and have a hot bath in the hot springs of Tiberias. This is where we started, right? So the hot springs of Tiberias, so that's naturally heated water. This is not considered water that was heated by fire. There was a minority opinion that that water also is heated by fire, but the majority opinion is that the hot springs is heated by something else. If it's not fire, then it's some kind of derivative of the sun, so that was okay. You could take a bath in the hot springs of Tiberias, but you couldn't go to a bathhouse for a sweat or a hot bath. What did people do? They went to the bathhouse and they had a hot bath in the bathhouse and claimed that they were that they had gone to Tiberias. I'm wondering how this really works. Like, were there people in Jerusalem, which was like a 2-day walk, claiming that they had been in Tiberias? Or was it more like, well, people in Tiberias could take a hot bath, so I'm going to take a hot bath. I'm just going to make sure that it's a bathhouse where they're not heating up the water before Shabbat. But the sages said, all right, that's it. Forget the Tiberias exception, forget the sweat exception, forget the pre-Shabbos heating exception. No hot baths on Shabbos at all, not even in Tiberias. What happened? People did it anyway. People did it anyway. Not just some people, a lot of people. It had become too much of a tradition already to have that hot bath on Shabbos. And so the sages backed off from their position because people just weren't listening to it anyway. And lest they come to, have laws that no one was following and make transgressors of people who didn't need to be transgressors, right? I mean, obviously, if you transgress a biblical commandment, that you're a transgressor of a biblical commandment, that can't be changed. But if they had promulgated a law, a rabbinic law, that made people into transgressors, but they later realized was an unnecessary law, then they had gone too far. And so they backed off and they said, okay, in Tiberias, yes, in Tiberias you can bathe in the hot spring. So you can bathe in a hot spring, a naturally hot spring on Shabbos. We're talking about bathing, right? So washing. You can do that in Tiberias, but elsewhere, no. You still cannot take a hot bath or a hot shower on Shabbos, even if that water was heated before Shabbos. But that working with the legislation, as it were, right? It was that kind of historical evolution of how they got there based on the behavior of the crowd. And then they even had to back off a little bit, again, based on the behavior of the crowd. Now, this is not to say that we can say, oh, well, we see what the logic is and what the crowd is doing, and we're going to make rulings for ourselves. No, because in fact, we have established laws and customs now, and we're bound by them, right? It's sort of like that period of the rabbis seeing what works and what doesn't, passed. And so that's how we ended up with the current law as it is. Okay, and I just wanted to read that to you. But anyway, that was a development of that law. Okay, so that's that. Then we also have, and what's interesting is that, so it seems like, in the Babylonian Talmud, it says that the people just didn't listen on that Tiberias decree, and ended up with, and so they backed off from saying you can't even go into the hot springs in Tiberias. Interestingly, the Jerusalem Talmud says that the reason they kind of backed off from the full scope of that prohibition is the Jerusalem Talmud says they backed off the final scope of that prohibition because the people came to restrain themselves. Not because the people wouldn't listen, but because the people came to listen, right? They understood what they needed to do. There was like a catch-up period that it's like they made rulings and the people weren't listening, but over time they listened to those rulings, and so they didn't need a further restriction, a further prohibition. They didn't need to extend the fence around the Torah anymore. Ed Berg says, so only Tiberias hot springs or any hot springs. I'm not sure about that. You have to look up that law. My guess is you probably can go into a hot spring, to bathe that isn't in Tiberias. The question then becomes, what about a heated pool, right? What about a heated pool? We've talked a little bit about swimming, and that even today the law is unclear on that. You will definitely find conflicting rulings in different communities and from different rabbis, even in the Orthodox world, on whether one can swim in the pool. And we're actually going to touch on that in a moment. But to get there, there's something that we have to note, right? You cannot heat up water to cook in or to drink on Shabbos, right? You can't put a kettle on a fire, boil water, and make tea. For sure, you can't do that. But all the time, we put food on a hot plate, right? Called a blech, and the blech is not super hot. But if you put a pot, right? If you put a covered pot on a blech, it'll get quite hot. And so, how hot can liquid get that you're warming on Shabbat? We have the ruling here on page 40 in Tractate Shabbos. And the answer is, we may warm liquids. This is per the opinion of Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel. We may warm liquids so long as they don't become so hot that we recoil to the touch, right? So like if you can put your finger in it and it's not too bad, that's okay for sure, right? If it's boiling, it's definitely not okay. So there's this like in between where you can get it warm, right? You can get it pretty warm, almost hot, but not so hot that you would recoil to the touch. That's how much you can warm a liquid on Shabbat. And so that's why if you look at a pool or even a hot tub, right? Can you get into a hot tub that's hot on Shabbat? A lot of people will say no, absolutely not. There's too many prohibitions, too many possible prohibitions being violated. You might come to wring the towel, you might come to wring the swimsuit, etc. But others will say, well, in terms of the amount of heat in a hot tub, you're just not getting that hot. It's not going to be so hot that you recoil to the touch, obviously, if it's something that a person would get into. A different restriction comes up here with regard to being in a pool, right? Like a hot tub or a pool. And that is if you can imagine, we've talked about in chapter 1 of Tractate Shabbos, we were looking at domains, right? And we saw that if you have a large enough difference between ground level and a pit, right? And the difference would be more than 10 hands breadths, 10 tefachim. So then it's considered a different domain. And if you splash water out of the pool, it's like you're transferring water from one domain to another. So that's one of those potential prohibitions that you would violate if you went swimming. But if you swim in a pool, you can't swim in a pond because there's like mud around the edge of the pond, right? And when your foot goes into the mud, it's like you're digging a hole. That's considered digging a hole, prohibited labor on Shabbos. But if it's a pool and it has a coping, right? If this is the surface of the water and this is the edge of the pool, if it's like this, water will splash out. But if it's like this, right, then that's considered an edge that will prevent water splashing out of the pool. And according to the sage of the Talmud, that is permitted, right? There might be other reasons. You can't rely on a ruling from Sal to say you can go swimming on Shabbos. I'm telling you that you have to check with your rabbi because there's a lot of conflicting rulings on this. But per page 40 of Tractate Shabbos in the Talmud, we have the ruling. Where was it? Is it actually page 41? this right. I want to just answer. Sorry. Why am I having trouble with this? I know I saw it. Well, I guess you're just going to have to. I know I saw it, but the idea was a person may not float in a pool full of water. It is prohibited to swim on Shabbat, even in a pool in a courtyard. It is permitted, though, to swim in a pool with an edge around it that prevents the water from splashing outside the pool, as per the conclusion of the Gemara. Okay, whew. I knew it was there. Okay, those are rulings that go into a decision if you're considering swimming on Shabbos. But what it appears from what we've learned today here on page 40 of Tractate Shabbos is that in terms of the warmth of the water, that won't be the prohibition because you're not going to be heating it so hot that you would recoil to the touch. In terms of splashing water out of the pool, if you have a coping that prevents that from happening, then you would do away with that possibility. If, however, you're still concerned that you may come to wring out the towel or wring out the swimsuit, or there's some other, or it's just not Shabbosistic, those are other reasons why swimming would be prohibited. Okay. We also encounter the idea of the secondary vessel, right? So if you want to make tea or coffee on Shabbos, coffee from an instant coffee, right? That's possible. Or making tea. What you can't do is you have an urn with that boil the water, right? So we have these Shabbos urns. We fill them Friday afternoon before Shabbos, and they boil the water before Shabbos. After that, they're only keeping the water warm that was already heated before Shabbos. That's why we can use them. Nevertheless, we can't make tea. We can't take a cup with a tea bag and put water directly into it from that boiling water, because that's considered receiving boiling water or boiled water, water that was heated with fire from a primary vessel, which was the urn, right into the tea bag, and therefore we're cooking on Shabbos. But if you take water from the Shabbos urn into a cup, we use a measuring cup for this, a glass measuring cup, and then you take that hot water and pour it into the teacup, that is permitted on Shabbos because it's a secondary vessel, right? The water in that vessel cannot be as hot as what was in the urn. It could never be hot enough. And so that is one of those allowances, one of those permissibilities that we have. Once liquid that was heated before Shabbos, kept warm during Shabbos, and it can be made into tea as long as it doesn't come from the primary vessel right to the teacup, but rather through an intermediate vessel, which becomes a secondary vessel. Okay, that's what I have for us today. I'm going to check comments and questions in one moment. Tomorrow is one you should tune in for. Shabbos is tomorrow evening, so I'm going to try to go live at about noon Pacific, so noon Pacific, about 3 p.m. Eastern, maybe even a little earlier if possible. But tomorrow we're going to be looking at page 4, with God's help, we'll be looking at page 41 of Tractate Shabbos. And here, now that we've been talking about bathing, we're going to talk about what our sages say regarding modesty, right? Can you bathe in a river naked? And if you do, so what happens regarding modesty? And from that, we're going to get over into what happens when a Jewish male, is permitted or is not permitted to touch his private parts, and what the reasoning is there. And that leads to a discussion on the prohibition of spilling semen, which is not well understood. It is an absolute prohibition, but what's interesting is why. Why is it prohibited? What is the result of that prohibition? What are the implications of that prohibition? And we'll be discussing that in tomorrow's session. Okay. Jerry says hello from Ohio. Ed Burke, Christine, Judy's in Anaheim. We discussed the hot springs. Are these beautiful? Hello, hello, hello. What is this? Rebecca Hope says there's 100 shooting stars an hour starting tonight. You know, isn't it great, guys? Have you noticed how much cleaner the skies are? I don't know where you live. I live in LA, and we don't see many stars from our backyard under normal conditions. We still don't see so many, primarily because of light pollution, right? There's just so much light in a city that it's very limited how many stars you'll see. It's nothing like being out in the countryside or out at sea. But there's so many fewer cars on the road now. The air is so much cleaner. We see a lot more stars. And that's been one of those silver linings. And Ed said, but when you step out of the pool, the water on your body will drip off you. Would that be prohibited? I think well, first of all, I think there's going to be two questions involved. One would be the age-old conflict between Rav Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, right? So you're not trying to transfer water, right? You're only getting yourself out of the pool. So it's an inadvertent transfer of water, what drips off you into that other domain. So per Rav Yehuda, since it's possible that you'll transfer water, then the main activity, which would otherwise be permitted, becomes prohibited. But the halacha generally follows Rabbi Shimon, who says that the inadvertent result, which is prohibited, of an otherwise permitted activity does not render the permitted activity prohibited, unless, right, the inadvertent effect, right, the thing that you're just trying to swim, right? So you're trying to do something that is otherwise permitted, but if the prohibited effect of that, right, it's caused by something that's permitted, but if the effect is not just a possibility, but a guarantee, right? If for sure something's going to happen which is prohibited, then the activity becomes prohibited. So that would be part of that analysis, and I think it's a good question. Aren't you transferring water? And I'm not sure. I'm not sure how it goes. But I think if some sources permit swimming, then somehow that particular aspect of it, which is a great question, Ed, I'm not sure why it doesn't come into play. I'm thinking probably because you might not drip. You might not really drip, or it's negligible dripping. There's a chance you won't drip onto the outside, something like that. But I'm not sure. Okay, is that the last question? I think so. Okay, that's what I've got for us tonight. I look forward, with God's help, to see you again tomorrow. And another thing that I'd really like people to start thinking about, and just, it's getting late now, but for tomorrow's show, I'll invite the comments. What are the silver linings of the pandemic, right? None of us wants this. All of us want it to be over as soon as possible. A lot of people are suffering. But I'll check the comments. You can put it even now if you're watching later on the rerun, or I'm going to tune out and finish the show, but you can just keep adding to the comments. And then I look to mention what people said and ask the question again tomorrow. What are the silver linings? What are we learning? How are we improving our behavior? What good things are happening? I'll just mention one right off and then I'll sign off, which is the Seder that we had last week with just us, the four of us. It was beautiful. Normally we'd have a much bigger Seder, or we would be part of a Passover program, and those things are wonderful too. But the fact that we as a family had to prepare for Passover, and then just the four of us together really explored the ins and outs of the Seder and of the Haggadah, we ended up having a beautiful experience. So that's one of the silver linings of the pandemic, and I'm curious what other silver linings people are having. Sending you all big love from the West Coast. Look forward to see you tomorrow morning. I said noon. Let's aim for 11 Pacific. 11 Pacific for tomorrow's show. All the best.